And this is a simple, it's not a simple question, but it's a short question. How is it possible
That's not necessarily the same thing.
That's right. So how is it possible to maintain a movement of that scale for a long period of time?
Well, all kinds of things are possible if people understand the necessity for them. You know, you see, for example, in response to disasters of various kinds, all kinds of people swing into motion and donate all kinds of resources and things because they're so motivated to do so. When people don't the reason I spent a long time in my remarks talking about why this is necessary, what the actual situation we're dealing with and what the and you know what the implications of it are, is because the key to people acting is not being tricked into something. It's not having a clever way to get them to do something. You may get people to do things, but that's not going to be sustained and it's not going to go in a good direction. In order for people to act in the kind of way that's necessary and is being called for here, they have to understand why it's necessary. Because you are calling on people to, to step outside of their comfort zone, to use that phrase. You are calling on people to make sacrifices, to break with their normal routine, to break with the way they would like to hope things could be resolved, many people at least. Most people would hope that it wouldn't require extraordinary efforts on their part to actually, move this situation in a positive direction and avert a disastrous outcome. People, once again, we go back to Harriet Tubman and the slaves. There's a tendency among people to stay with the horror they know rather than to risk the one they don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's something we have to struggle against. That's why people have to understand what are the stakes here. It's not that we're, making this up or exaggerating again in order to trick people into doing something. Study yourself. Look into the reality of this. Look into what we're saying. Look into what I was talking about today. Is it true or not true? If it's true, what are the implications? What do people need to do? It's on that basis that people will act. And, there have been plenty of examples of that. There are examples, in the contemporary world where people did succeed in ousting, a government, or forcing a head of government to resign. Sometimes with good outcomes, sometimes with not. But there have been examples in places, for example, like South Korea. There have been, I felt a tremendous surge of pride when William Westmoreland, I don't know if any of you are familiar with him, but he was, for a number of years, the commander of the American forces in Vietnam. And he was replaced, and he came back and ran this line out that a lot of reactionary fools run out. But it did kind of give you a sense of pride when he said, "We never lost the war in Vietnam. We lost it in Berkeley." And I felt like, not just out of narrow considerations because I came from Berkeley, but, understanding that what he meant metaphorically. We lost it because people in this country stood up against it and continued to fight against it until, that merged with the resistance that the Vietnamese people were putting up and refusing to be subdued. And we were forced to finally give it up. And so, that was a more protracted process than we can afford right now. We can't afford 8-10 years of this. It has to be much more telescoped. It has to be much more immediate. But the same principle applies. People became convinced that war was just so horrific. I mean, they killed 3 million people in Vietnam, the U.S. Many of them civilians, many of them little children. The My Lai massacre that many of you may know about, but everybody should know about, where they went into a village and just wiped out everybody, old people, children, everything, and then lied about it. And by the way, while I'm at it, one of their great heroes, Colin Powell, was an officer in the military at that time who was one of the main people responsible for covering up or trying to cover up what happened at My Lai. But as has been shown by people who studied this, that was not an exception. That was a pattern. That was what the U.S. military did. Go into villages and just slaughter people. they dropped napalm, on little children as well as other people. Napalm, which they first used, by the way, in the Korean War, is basically jellied gasoline. And it when it lands on people, it just essentially sets their flesh on fire. Some of you may have seen that picture of that little girl back from the days of the Vietnam War, running down a road naked, having been subjected to a napalm attack. They used Agent Orange, which is a chemical weapon. They destroyed large parts of it. Vietnam was an agricultural country where people depended overwhelmingly on farming. They destroyed large parts of the land with these chemical weapons. You see, in this, when I was talking about, the generation that came of age in the 1960s and some of the great things they did, and then far too many have become, to use that French word, récupéré, recouped, brought back within the under the wing of the system. A lot of those people did really heroic things. Some of them did stupid things because they became frustrated, and they tried ways of fighting back that weren't going to lead to anything positive. But overwhelmingly, people did really positive things in standing up against that. And it's because they became convinced. They refused to allow this to be done in their name. First of all, they recognized the horror it was, but also it was being done in their name. Just as these horrors are being committed today in our name. You hear these fascists, the American people, this and that. Well, the American people is not one big blob. There are a lot of different people, who have different viewpoints on things. And there's a large section of people that can't stand what's going on now. And we have to reach those people and get them to understand the necessity of what's going on. The necessity of dealing with what's going on, the reality of what's going on, and the necessity of dealing with it. That's the way things can become sustained, is when people really come to see the full dimensions of what's happening and the implications of what will happen if it's allowed to go on the course, to continue on the course it's going on. There's no shortcut to getting people to do what needs to be done. Yes, we should find a way for people to do things while they're learning. We should find a way for people to be involved while they have questions, and we should discuss their questions with them. We shouldn't treat people as if they're idiots because they have questions or they don't agree with something. We should honestly discuss these things. If someone can show that all this is not really that bad, and that the implications are not all really that terrible, well, fine. There's still plenty wrong in the world, but at least we don't have to do this. But let somebody show that. Let's see the argument. But the reality is, and there's plenty of evidence to show this reality, that it really is this horrible, that it really is going to go in a very disastrous direction. I mean, I don't know what the tactics are and the differences are, but what does it mean when someone like Trump, says these things about, that, North Korea is going to face, terrible destruction like it's never been seen before? Or he gets up in the UN, of all places, and says he's going to, if they dare to do anything against us, we're going to utterly destroy them. What does it mean when he just, says this weekend, there's only one course of action to deal with North Korea? That's just one dimension. It's a very, it is a terrible dimension. And even though there's a lot of jockeying and a lot of, rhetoric being thrown around, things even on that basis can spin out of control. This is very dangerous. And that's just one dimension of the disaster that's in store. And people will move, people will act on the basis of understanding that and being one to see that. Not by being yelled at, Some people deserve to be yelled at, okay? But people who are, these people who went to Charlottesville, you're not going to reason with them, okay? and certainly not in their masses. But there are a lot of people who are good-hearted, who want to see a better world, but are not convinced of things. You have to look. We can't sit down and talk to them for days while everything's going on. But you have to get them moving, and let's discuss things while we're moving. Let's have some debate here. Let's dig into the reality here. That's the way we have to. That's the way anything good will be built. Is if we unite with people to act on the basis of what they understand at a given time, given that it's going in a positive direction, and continue to debate and struggle about what is the bigger picture into which all this fits. And that applies to driving out the Trump-Pence regime, and for us communists, it applies to the whole thing of making revolution. I was going to say, I got diverted myself. I have to get this in, talking about the Vietnam War. See, here's the problem again. One of the chants that people, the most popular chant during the anti-war demonstrations at the time of Vietnam, when LBJ, the Democratic president, was the one presiding over this slaughter in Vietnam. One of the popular chants was, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids have you killed today?" For very good reason. Now you see all these liberals like Rob Reiner, who, by the way, once knew better. He wasn't always, where he's at now. He once understood a lot more and spoke in better terms. Makes a movie, glorifying LBJ. So, there's a lot of struggle that has to go on. But those people, you see, in those days, the motion was positive. I myself, was hanging around on the Berkeley campus in those days. And I saw not just one, but a number of people who came out of families who were right-wing Republicans, voted for Barry Goldwater. Now, some of you may not know about Barry Goldwater, but you can go back and find out. Was extremely right-wing, and to the point is sort of tottering on lunacy, who was a Republican candidate for president in 1964. I knew people, students at Berkeley, whose families voted for Goldwater, and they were, terrific radicals within 1 year. Because they were young and they weren't tied into, the idea that things could only be this way. And they weren't invested in the idea that you have to go along with the way things are, or the way your parents told you the world is the only way that it could possibly be. Back in those days, well, see here I'm going to get myself into trouble. Back in those days, we had a slogan, "Don't trust anybody over 30." Because, the country was being run by a bunch of old fuddy-duddies who were resisting everything good and waging the war in Vietnam and so on. And, now I'm really going far afield, but Jerry Rubin, who was one of the main organizers against the Vietnam War, was one of the people who helped popularize that slogan. Then when he turned 31, he said, "Well, we have this slogan, don't trust anybody over 35. So we have to be careful about sliding principles here. But my main point is get back to the main point is that people went through big changes in those times because big questions were being thrown up. And those who weren't deeply invested in, this is the best of all possible things that couldn't possibly be any better, and anybody who says anything different ought to be forced to go to Russia or whatever, or told love it or leave it or whatever. The people who weren't invested in that were not only willing, but they felt compelled to look into these things because so many big questions were being thrown up. And people went through big changes very quickly, and that has to happen and can happen now, but it has to happen in a very telescoped way because, as I said, the resistance to the Vietnam War was very important, but it built and was sustained over years and years. We don't have years and years now. So we've got to do this in a very intense and telescoped way. But the key point is people change because they're challenged, but also they're united with where they do have good instincts and good impulses, and they're challenged to look at the world as it actually is and to come to the conclusion about what needs to be done on that basis. When they see the necessity, even as they're being united with, when they see that this is what's really needed, what really needs to happen, that's when people can get involved and can sustain things.